So you look at sexual taboos today, okay? Why do we have sexual taboos? To shame women into proper behavior, okay? So for example, okay, if a man sleeps with 1,000 women, we think, great, he's a stud. He's good looking, he's rich, he's tall, he's a stud, right? But hey, if a woman sleeps with 1,000 men, she's a slut. She's a bad person. She has no ethical, she lacks ethics. She lacks morality. She has no character. Therefore, we must avoid her, okay? Why does this make any logical sense? Why is this true? Guys, why is this true? Okay. Yeah?
Maybe because in recent society it is like how to say that they treat our people. It just says like the woman has no worth than a man.
Exactly. We have this, okay? We have this prejudice because men are considered superior to women, and therefore men want to control women. And the best way to do that is by controlling the woman's body. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so this is just a cultural prejudice. There's no biological evidence this is true, okay? All right, so we have a lot of evidence that women want sexual agency, okay? Women want to have sex. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so for example, we look at monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and females will aggressively seek males out for sex, okay? So it's the females that are proactive. You also look at bonobos monkeys, okay? In bonobos monkeys, it's interesting because the females are in charge. The females have sex with each other. Why? Why do they have sex with each other? Why will females have sex with each other? What's the purpose of that? Unity, right? Does it make sense? Unity, to get along, to cooperate better. Okay? And then they will also have sex with males, but they initiate the sex. Okay? There are some cultures where it's the female that will initiate the sex with the male. Okay? All right? So at Harvard and UCLA, they discovered, okay, the moment they discovered the plow, agriculture, these societies have lower levels of female participation in politics and the labor force, okay? Meaning like before, where men and women did the same work, both had the same political power. But once men showed that they could contribute more to society, men started to have more power, okay? Does that make sense? So in other words, differences between men and women are not biological constructs, okay? They are cultural constructs. And for most of human history, men and women were equal. Okay? Any questions so far?
I just have like a question about the previous thing. It's like you said about black and white, and in the ancient times they're completely opposite. So how does it change to be completely opposite?
Okay, so the idea of black and white, it's like white is good, black is bad. It's a recent construct, okay? It comes with the idea of race, okay? And race was invented about 200 years ago. Why? Because Europe was going around conquering the world, and they needed to justify why they were doing this. And the theory is because we're superior people. Our race is better than your race. Okay, does that make sense? So race is a recent cultural construct, and it was to justify imperialism, the conquest of other people for no reason. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So all this is recent. Okay. All right. There's a really fun book called Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan. Okay. And what he argues is that for most of human history, women had sexual agency and they had multiple sexual partners. And one piece of evidence is this. Gorillas, right? They're the biggest primates. They're huge, right? Well, it turns out their penises, when fully erect, is only 4 centimeters, okay? Men, who are a lot smaller than gorillas, when erect, they are at least almost 4 times as big as the gorilla penises, okay? So the question then is, why is this the case? And one theory is that when women have multiple sexual partners, the man with the bigger penis will spread his gene forward. Does that make sense, guys? Okay? And so this is evidence that for most of human history, women have had multiple sexual partners. Okay? Okay. So even when women had partners, okay, a husband, they still had sexual partners. Okay? And in some societies, women have many husbands, usually brothers together, okay? All right, let me ask you this question. Why do they do this? Right? Because we've been taught this. We've been taught, okay, we exist to spread our genes. Right? You understand? So if I marry someone, only if I'm sure that the offspring, the children, are mine, will I work hard to ensure that the children are fed and raised properly and educated. Okay? Does that make sense? So we've been taught for a long time that we first care about our genes. Okay? That's why men want to have as many wives and children as possible, and women want to find the wealthiest husband. But for most of human history, this was not true. Why? Why, guys? Okay, so it has to do with the idea of religion, okay? So the first thing is that we all come from the mother goddess. We're all equal, right? So it doesn't matter if it's my son or my friend's son. They're all the children of the mother goddess, and therefore I have responsibility to protect the children, okay? Does that make sense? So there was no concept of individual. There was only a concept of community. Okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is they really didn't understand genes, okay? They didn't understand, like, okay, a child has 50% genes from the mother, 50% genes from the father, okay? How they understood was, okay, you have the woman, she gives life, the man gives energy. Okay, does that make sense? Therefore what? If you believe this, then what? If the mother gives life, the man gives energy, what? What?
The better energy, the better the child is.
Right, but how do you get better energy? More men, right? You understand? If men are giving you energy, the more men you have sex with, the more energy you have. Does that make sense? So, the evidence is, if you look at the people in Melanesia, okay, they believe that semen provided energy. And so you need a lot of semen, okay? So what would happen is that when a woman married a husband, what would happen is the members of the husband's family would come and have sex with her that very night in order to get as much energy as possible from the family. Does it make sense, guys? Okay? Any questions so far? I know this is controversial, but I'm just trying to show you how our cultural beliefs is radically different from the cultural beliefs of people in the past. Okay? Does it make sense? Okay, so one last piece of evidence is this. When you don't know when the people don't know who the father is, everyone has a responsibility to protect the child. Okay, does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so the story is this Christian missionary, he goes into a village and he finds people just sleeping with each other. Okay, there's no marriage, there's no husband and wife, people are just sleeping with each other. And the priest says to them, "You people are shameless." And one of the villagers replies, "You have no sense. You French people love only your own children, but we all love all the children of our tribe." Okay? You understand? So having multiple sexual partners is a way to build community for everyone. If you're a small community, okay, maybe 15, 20 people, it makes sense to make sure that everyone loves each other and that everyone will protect all the children. Does that make sense, guys? All right. So let me tell you a story to illustrate this fact. We know that in World War II, okay, in World War II, American pilots, okay, what they were doing is they were sleeping with each other's wife. Okay, does that make sense? The reason why they were doing this is American pilots were more likely to die in war than any other soldiers. Does that make sense, guys? Therefore, you slept with the wife of your colleagues in order to ensure that if you died, they would protect your children. Because there's a good chance you would die in war, okay? You were afraid that if I died, who's going to look after my wife and who's going to look after my children? And the way you build intimacy and community is by sleeping with each other's wife. So that you became one big family. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Any questions so far? I know this is controversial. I know this is hard to understand, okay? But we have evidence that for most of human history, women had sexual agency and power, and sex was a way to build community, okay? Does it make sense? Yeah?
I think this idea is pretty advanced at this stage, but do you think it is backwards compared to the? Let me I think at the early stage it's pretty advanced. The idea is pretty advanced, but do you think it is backwards to do you think it is backwards compared with these days?
Okay, that's a great question, okay? So the question is this backwards or is it primitive? Okay, and what I want to show you this semester is that, okay, guys, there's no such concept as backward and primitive, okay? The reason why we care about sex more than any other people is the idea of private property, okay? Private property. Okay? So, for example, if I have a wife, and I do have a wife, okay? We have 3 kids, okay? I want my 3 kids to inherit the money, right? But if my wife goes sleep with other people, then who gets the private property? So in other words, we have the idea of sex as shameful Because we live in a we live in a patriarchy. Okay, does that make sense? All right. Okay. Sorry. Let me explain some more later on. Okay. All right. Let's move on. All right. So I want to conclude with this idea. I want to conclude. Maria Gimbutas argued that old Europe was ruled by women, or women were part of the political class. And because of that, Europe at that time was more peaceful and more stable than at any other time in its history. Does that make sense? So another question then is, why would women as a political class be more effective than men as a political class? Okay, and there are three reasons. All right, the first reason is women are more willing to cooperate and collaborate. Okay, does that make sense? So men are competitive. We like status. We like power. But women are much more humble. So women are much more likely to compromise and collaborate than men are. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Okay? So if men are in control, then men want all the power. But if women are in control, then women are much more willing to share power with men. Does that make sense? The other thing is, let's just say like your community gets in conflict with another community. Well, what would happen is the women leaders of your community would get together with the women leaders of that community, and you could quickly negotiate a compromise. Right? But men are competitive, they like status, they like face. So it's much more likely that when men start to negotiate, it becomes violent. Does that make sense? Okay? So that's one thing that women are better at. Women are better at collaborating and compromising. That's the first thing. Second thing is that women have more emotional intelligence. Does that make sense, guys? Meaning like men care about rules, right? Women care more about you as a person. Therefore, women are much better at managing people. Does that make sense? Okay? The third thing is like men can use violence to coerce other people, right? Women are not as physically strong as men, therefore they have other strategies for controlling men. And the two main strategies are gossip, okay? Basically talking about you behind your back, which forces you to conform, but also sex, okay? So if the woman spreads sex evenly among the men have no reason to fight. And if a man does something bad against the community, the woman can choose to not have sex with this man, okay? As a way to punish him. But this is all very subtle and nonviolent ways of forcing people to conform to the rules of the society, okay? Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions? This is confusing to you guys, right? Okay, so let's conclude, okay? Before the conquest of the Yamnaya, old Europe was a peaceful, egalitarian society, okay? And a lot of the reason why is that women were given higher status in society. So it was women who made the rules, who were the political class in society. And because of that, women are able to use nonviolent ways to control society, making society much more peaceful and stable. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Any questions? Excuse me? Okay. So the question is, if people are not violent, how do you control society? Okay, and so the way you can control people is through the idea of shame. Okay, because everyone wants to get along. Okay, all right. So, all right. Here's a fun experiment. Okay, here's a fun experiment. What you guys can do is every time you walk the hallways and you see a person wearing red, like a girl wearing red, you tell her, "You look fantastic." Okay? I guarantee you within like 2 weeks, all the girls in the school will be wearing red. Does that make sense? So you're controlling people, but you're not using violence. You're using the idea of gossip, shame, and flattery. And that's what women do really well. Do you understand? Okay, does that answer your question? Okay. Any more questions? Yeah, so you don't have to use violence. You can also use flattery, okay? Right? Any more questions? Okay, so next class, what we'll do is we will look at the Yamnaya people, okay? Because the Yamnaya people are violent, they love war, they're patriarchy, and they have private property. The question then is, okay, how did they come about, okay? What's their origin story? And why were they so successful in conquering old Europe, okay? So that's a story we will look at next class.